The New York Football Giants season came to a bit of a crashing end in the divisional round of the playoffs against the bitter rival Philadelphia Eagles. We take a very brief look at that loss and then immediately turn our attention to the contract conversations around Leonard Williams, Saquon Barkley, and of course, the biggest one of all, Daniel Jones, and what those negotiations could look like this offseason. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. And as we said at the top, Andy, we are going to talk about this divisional round loss, but we all kind of agree. We don't need to dwell on what was a really disappointing cap to the 2022-2023 season for Big Blue.
Yeah, I think it's important to spend 5 minutes just talking about the game itself, but it feels like we don't want to put a damper on what we would consider an overall successful season in year one for Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen and the rest of the organization. But yeah, I mean, look, the Giants went into this game into the link 8 o'clock Saturday night with all intentions of going up there and making some noise. And they felt pretty confident being that road team and getting momentum. And that momentum got crushed very quickly. And it felt like midway through the second quarter that game was pretty much going to be a wrap unless something drastic changed.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you said it about you build up with confidence. And I think this isn't like retroactively looking back at it. You go, some people said, well, the Colts game, hey, you have to really put a lot of stock in that. Doesn't matter that they're bad. Well, it does matter. And I think we'll, in the course of the offseason, go over some of the games in the schedule, where they got their wins, where they got their losses, right? And what it can tell you about this team overall. It's still a really good year. Getting to the playoffs was a really good year. Winning a playoff game was an absolutely great year. And this is just a really disappointing way to end it. And inside of this game, I'll say, there were a lot of things to not be happy about in this game. The running defense, something we'll touch on. But for me, at like the high level, it was, boy, I didn't love the game plan just from the word go. And I'm not saying that the Giants, play this game 100 times. They probably lose a significant percentage of them. And yet, when you and I talked in the preview show, it was like, got to try to open it up. You got to try to do some things in the passing game. You got to try to use Daniel Jones to every way possible. I think the Giants' approach was, let's try to slow this thing down. Let's try to grind this thing down. And I don't know if that, not the results be damned. I just don't know if that would have been the right approach or should have been the right approach coming in. And maybe it just comes down to there were very few avenues for them to actually effectively try to win this game.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about the run defense. Obviously, the Giants go on to lose the game 38-7.
Yeah.
It was 28-0 at halftime. It felt like everyone was packing it up. I think everyone felt comfortably that we weren't going to see a repeat of the Chargers and Jaguars game where all of a sudden, there's a miraculous comeback. It was can the Giants outscore them in the second half, look a little bit more competitive in the game? 38-7, kind of a wash. But you alluded to it, Adam. They had 268 yards on the ground. They scored 3 rushing touchdowns. They averaged over 6 yards a carry. If you can't stop a team that just says we're just going to keep running it down your throat, it almost feels even more demoralizing, right? Like there was nothing that the Giants could do to stop the run game of Miles Sanders, Jalen Hurts, Kenneth Gainwell. It just felt like the Giants were on their back heels constantly.
Say his name. You say that terrible man's name. You say the bad man's name. Boston Scott got us again.
And yes, he did get us again, which is just uncanny. I thought you were saying the bad man's name is in terms of Jalen Smith in the middle for the Giants. In terms,
what? So here's
trying to do whatever he can to block people. The one thing I will say on the run game, it also felt like when the Giant, no one played well on almost any side of the ball except for maybe Andrew Thomas. But every time they had somebody wrapped up, it felt like they were falling forward or continuing their momentum for another 3, 4, 5, 6 yards. Yep. The Giants just really did not have anything of consequence going on at him.
So here's one of the things too, and a lot of people were talking about it, over on social media, and some of them really fans were like couching it and like, trust me, I'll regret a lot of the things I'm saying now, but like I need to be able to say it. Like this guy stinks, this guy's awful, like Jalen Smith. This is the part where I go like, thanks so much, Jalen Smith. Like, you had a great year for us because you were literally a scrap heap guy and came in and serviceably filled in for big chunks of the season. This is where like your deficiencies are going to get more and more exposed, right? In a playoff game against a really talented roster. And there's a number of guys throughout this roster you can talk about. Some people are even throwing Julian Love under the bus in this game as well for his performance. Again, there was a lot of across the board things that I didn't like. One thing I'll say is, and we'll move off of the game pretty quickly here. The one thing I'll say is when it's 14-0, and this isn't, I'm not nitpicking down to it, but you look at the most important players, right? It's hard to look at the production or lack thereof from Saquon Barkley in this game and be elated about it. We know that PFF is not the end-all be-all, but what I will tell you is inside of this game, the offensive line all had very consistent offensive passing grades as well as pass protection grades. And, the running grade actually was pretty bad for a lot of the guys on this team. You said outside of, an Andrew Thomas. And the reason why I bring it up is because when you're down 14-0 in this game, by the end of it, you say, well, you're never going to have a chance to win it. It was a bad game for Daniel Jones, right? As good as the Vikings game was, it was a bad game. Doesn't mean it changes my opinion about him, but it was a bad game. You throw the ball 2.5 yards behind, Darius Slayton on the inside, an easy pick it had to be James Bradbury, right? Couldn't go to anybody else. Had to go to the giant that they had to cut because of cap constraints. It was a really rough one to watch when you see Daniel Jones, his final game of the season is an 11.4 QBR. And I only bring it up to say that if you're going to look at this game, don't get lost in the second half where this thing's already over and you're just kind of going through the motions in a lot of ways. Dable is punting and kind of already waving the white flag, all of those things. In the first quarter and a half of this game, that's where everyone was maximum effort trying to do everything they could. And this was just an example. Played incredibly well in his first bright lights scenario against the Vikings. Didn't play well in this game. And I don't think that the offensive play calling was suited to what they should have been doing. He should have been moving. He should have been mobile. It should have been with his legs to start this game. And he came up a little bit short, as did several other players. But when we talk about Jones being the franchise quarterback, yeah, that's why we're more critical here. I'm not going to be critical about Richie James dropping the deep bomb, right? He's Richie James. It's a bad drop, but it's not like we're talking about him being the number one wideout next year.
Yeah, listen, Daniel Jones didn't have a good game. You're absolutely right. I mean, 11 QBR. He had a couple of missed throws. He didn't seem like he was in rhythm. He had that terrible interception to James Bradbury, which felt like that was like the first nail in the coffin for the Giants, where it's like, hey, if you can go down and find some points here, maybe you can settle into the game. That didn't happen. Really bad pick. He gave up, the offensive line gave up 5 sacks. And then they weren't even really rushing the passer that much in the fourth quarter. So that was all done relatively early. The offense just didn't get going. And I agree with you. The play calling was not great. Daniel Jones did not play well, period, end of story. I also don't think that the coaches put them in the best situation for success. You mentioned the game plan. Like, we saw how mobile Daniel Jones was against the Vikings. It felt like they went away from that and they were like, how can we just like plod along and waste time and pick up first downs, as opposed to, how do we generate an offense knowing that their pass rush is so tremendous? Like, to me, you're absolutely right. It felt like the game plan was a miss. Even on the defensive side of the ball, game plan was a disaster. Where was Landon Collins? Didn't even see him play at all. You thought his physicality may have helped us be able to maybe get up in there and stop the run. They were literally doing anything they wanted on their offensive side, and the Giants had no answer for it whatsoever.
Yeah, and by the way, let's be really clear, right? Wide receivers against really good cornerbacks. All of a sudden, Isaiah Hodgins, right? Guys start to disappear in big spots like this. So there's an understanding about what the correlation is between QB performance and those around him. And then just quickly on the defensive side, to your point, man, listen, Xavier McKinney, he's getting beat up having to cover Dallas Goedert. We wrapped all of our minds around this beautiful play against TJ Hawkinson against the Vikings, and then cut to it actually ended up being a difficult one. So, ultimately, everyone took it on the chin. Everyone said, hey, didn't perform well enough, got to build off of this, all those good things. Brian Dable said, bit of a crash landing for us at the end of our season. And also, and we'll talk about this more as the offseason goes along, and also still a great season. I still saw a lot of really good checks here for this team. And to your point, still a long way to go. So, okay, fine. Let's put the cap on that and we'll revisit it as we move along, because immediately within 24 hours of the end of their season, you get some of the exit interviews and you get a lot of key figures being asked key questions. We'll start with Saquon Barkley. It's also Leonard Williams, and then it's Daniel Jones. And I want to dedicate the most time to his response. This is the old, your agent is not thrilled with you. because Saquon Barkley comes out when asking about it. He said, I can't envision that being my last time in a Giants uniform. Went on to say, I'm not really too concerned with resetting any markets. I'm realistic. I know what I was on pace to do, but having 2 years injuries, didn't help. But I think I was able to show the caliber of player that I am. He effectively, inside of this, I wanted to show them the guy they drafted is still here. I hope I did that. Everyone knows I would love to be a Giant for life, but I really can't give 100% answers. Sometime this week, I'll have conversations with my agent, Kim, and we'll see what's up. But when you watch that live, it was like, this is where I want to be. I don't want to go anywhere else. We'll sort it out. That it's about as damning as you can be if you're an agent, and it makes you feel like the concern we had around paying Daniel Jones, cap room, all this stuff. Do you believe that at face value that Saquon Barkley is going to be willing to say if it's 10 instead of 14 or if it's 11 instead of whatever, incentives versus base salary, that he's willing to do that?
I mean, what a roller coaster ride we have been on since training camp, where we're thinking about like all the different permutations and scenarios of like who gets the franchise tag, who signs, who's going to
Yeah.
reset the market, what are people willing to spend. And then all of a sudden at the end of the season, you have Saquon come out and say something like this, where he's like, make no mistake, I want to be here and I don't need to be the highest paid running back. That's what I took away from
Yeah.
what he said. And while the agent's going to be upset because he wants to get top dollar for Saquon, what Saquon did was really, really smart. He's putting it all on the organization. He's like, I don't need to reset the running back market, and I also want to be here. So now it's on you guys to figure out how to make that work. And like, if Saquon now leaves and gets a relatively competitive offer somewhere else and the Giants didn't want to match it, Saquon can say, I wanted to finish my career as a Giant. Like he set himself up for a perfect situation. And when you think about what that contract would look like, just very quickly, there are 8 players at the running back position that make over $10 million a year, Adam. So there's 8 guys right now. When you think about what the number probably would be to get Saquon, he doesn't have to be the best paid, which is Christian McCaffrey at $16 million a year.
Right.
But let's say he's top 5 to 7 in the
Sure.
league in terms of what he gets paid. Like that to me seems like a reasonable place to start. And right in that range, Adam, is basically just over $12.5 million. So anywhere between 12.5 to about 14.5 million puts him in the top 5 running back range. How does that sit with you? Initial reaction, knowing that we have all offseason to talk about it.
Yeah, the dollar amount's fine, but I think, going back to the way the season ends and just the big picture, it's like there's a lot of work to do here. You don't want to lose the great players that you have, but you also don't want to overinvest money when you know you have a lot of holes. So I think that the dollar amount's fine. I'll be interested to see how it unfolds. I like that it seems like Saquon wants to be here, and I think you're right. He set it up where he has like a very easy out around it. But my expectations would be that he's back, and maybe it has a little bit of incentives built into it. The other guy we'll talk about here, and maybe this is interesting because I have a bit of I said this over on Twitter immediately following the game, and this could be logged into the little overreaction. I don't know, but Leonard Williams after said, "I try to let things like that play out. I believe the plan is the plan." Oh, sorry. It's the way he did. I believe the plan is the plan, and things are going to work out the way they work out. God, this guy's great. He's only using 4 words for 3 sentences. I did my best this year. I fought through injuries and played my hardest. I'm sure I'll end up somewhere, if not here. I want to play as long as possible. He went on to say, though, that he really loved playing with. I definitely love this team, and I want to be here. I want to play with Dexter Lawrence, as long as possible. Playing with someone like that helps me individually, and we help each other and the defense when we have 2 stout guys up front. Okay. I'm going to ask you your feelings about this. He has a $32 million cap hit going into next year, which obviously isn't going to live that way. He said he would get in with his agent and hash some things out if it needed to be. He said he couldn't say 100%, taking a cap reduction, all that kind of stuff, whatever. I am surprised because I like Leonard Williams. I'm positive on him. It's really hard. I know he had injuries, and it's about the linebacking core too. Really hard for me to look at how bad the run defense was and how good Dexter Lawrence was individually and think that Leonard Williams being on this roster next year is a foregone conclusion. If it was me, I actually think it's less likely he's here because of the cap more than anything, unless we're talking about a real reduction and extension of some kind to bring that number significantly down. And I'm talking about closer to 10 than 20.
So they asked Leonard Williams in that meeting, would you take a pay cut? Right.
Yeah.
And he said, I would probably consider it. And everyone was like, oh, okay. Like you're willing to give up money already. And then all of a sudden he backtracked it. Like in his mind, he's like, I probably shouldn't have said that. I got to talk to my agent. I got to see where the Giants' heads are at. None of us have talked about it. So, like, the fact that he's willing to say, I want to be here and I'm maybe willing to give up some money in order to be able to do it. Now, that's the initial reaction when you're gutted that you lose the game. Maybe cooler heads prevail when he goes, fishing in California, and goes and hangs out for a while. But I will say this. You mentioned the $32.5-ish million cap hit. It is really unsustainable at that number.
Everyone knows
he'd be one of the top 5 non-quarterback cap hits in all of the NFL. And like, while he is a great player, we just can't afford to have that much money tied up into one player when we have all of these holes, as we saw against the Eagles at various positions. So for me, I once right away, his salary is $18 million. That's to me where you say, all right, your salary's at 18, your cap hit's at 32. How can we either extend you and bring everything down, or will you take a little bit of a pay cut and try to get back out on the market? Whatever it is, like if the Giants can save $10 million by restructuring Leonard Williams, you're already most of the way there on getting Saquon Barkley, and you could keep both of those players around. The one thing I will say to you, Adam, which is a question mark, is Wink Martindale is interviewing for head coaching roles. What if the Giants get a new defensive coordinator in here that wants to play a 4-3, that doesn't want to play a 3-4, that has different ideas of what type of players they like to see? That may be just as impactful as whether or not Leonard Williams wants to take a pay cut, right?
Yeah, actually, you know what? That's a really good point, because when you think about the interior, you think about Dexter Lawrence. Well, you can put another big stud next to him in a 4-3 scheme potentially and say, hey, these guys can play well together. Leonard Williams, it's different. And the fact that Dexter Lawrence was able to be a bit of a wrecking ball in the middle in the 3-4 this year at the nose tackle only speaks better to that versatility. Yeah, I agree. And that's why it's interesting. I'm not again, it's not like a knock on Leonard Williams, the individual, but at 29, going to be 30 years old. The other big picture thing is for Joe Schoen. He's saying, yes, we're building. We want to compete. We probably are. Everyone agrees. Well, we're further after seeing that Eagles game than maybe we realized. And by the way, rewind yourself all the way back to the beginning of the year. We didn't think, right? Over under was set at 6.5 for the team in win total this season. So we understand there's a long way to go. And I do think that you have to be looking at it in the both and scenario. Yeah, keeping Leonard Williams around in the short term. He's a high quality player. You don't want to lose good players. And also, a year from now or 2 years from now, are we going to have the next wave of young players? Where's the free agent market going to be? And do we want to have a 31-year-old Leonard Williams on this roster potentially? So there's a lot of interesting things, I think, in and around the Leonard Williams decision and the financial impact. That's one to play itself out. And I think that Leonard Williams maybe spoke in ways that afforded the ability to say, I want to be here. Not unlike Saquon, where it's I want to be here, and we know he could be integral to what the Giants do. Leonard Williams is maybe saying, yeah, I want to be here. I don't want to go anywhere. And by the way, over the last end of this cycle, if they restructure it, guess what he also knows? Maybe there's a big payday for me coming if I play with Dexter Lawrence for another year or two and look as good as I possibly can. He also did, just to be clear, deal with a lot of injuries throughout this season that could have hindered him and obviously his production. Okay. Now,
well, the last thing I was going to say on the Leonard Williams front is, doesn't it also come down to what his market value is too? Is another if he were to be a free agent tomorrow, is another team going to give him a 3-year, $60 million deal? Is he a 20-something million dollar player on the open market? Because that will also dictate what Joe Schoen is going to come to him and ask for, right? And Leonard Williams may be able to give those concessions because he's like, do I really want to go somewhere else and create a whole new thing for a couple million more? Maybe it doesn't make too much sense.
Yeah, but the out that we're talking about, the Giants, has a $20 million dead cap hit. So this is where the Giants are a little bit hamstrung. It's like the Bradbury, right? Where you go, well, we'd like to. And he says, no, my money's my money. Now, it looks like Leonard Williams is more in the conversation, right, of wanting to be at the table and having those discussions. But if he says, I really do like the 32 million, though, you know what I mean? And then you go, okay. And that's where I wonder about trades potentially. You mentioned market value, the trade market value potentially, if you adjust this number, if the Giants are eating some of that. There's still a lot of the things we talked about last offseason with Joe Schoen. A lot of that's still going to carry over here about big decisions and cap room for this team. Okay, we'll continue, but don't worry. We'll continue to talk about that. Daniel Jones, this is what I found fascinating. So after this great season, and he certainly showed all the incremental progress that we want, he came out and said, asking the same questions. I mean, we'll cross that bridge when we get there in terms of coming back and contract negotiations. I've really enjoyed playing here. I appreciate all those guys in the locker room. It's a special group of guys, and I really enjoyed being a part of it. We'll figure out where that goes, but I have nothing but love and respect for this organization and the guys in the locker room. I think we'll get into that down the road. I think at this point, this is still very fresh this season. This loss will take some time to regroup and think about that going forward. He also went on to say, I've really enjoyed being here. I have nothing but love and respect for the organization. I'd love to be back, but we'll see. There's a business side of it too. Very grateful to be here and be a part of it. Just, man, instant reaction. I think you're playing it smart. You know what the QB market looks like. You know you want to maximize your value. He had a good conversation with his agent well before the season ended. But I was a little bit surprised that Daniel Jones kind of just sent the message of like, yeah, we'll see. And again, I don't think that it doesn't change my perspective of what's going to happen here. But I think he gets that this is payday time for him. And maybe this could be the only biggest payday that he gets, and he needs to maximize it.
So I agree that I was surprised that this was the tone that Daniel Jones took. It wasn't mean. It wasn't, I hate the organization. It was more of everyone thought that Daniel Jones would be groveling at the feet of the Giants organization saying, I want to be back. People are talking about what type of discount is he going to go for 20 million? Is he going to go for 23 million? Make no mistake. Daniel Jones is not going to settle for any of that. He's going to look at what he could get on the open market and turn around to the Giants and say, this is what my market value is today. Yep. Now, the real question comes out is, how much does he want to be here? Remember, this is an organization that has fired the general manager that drafted him. He's had 4 different coordinators try to help him. John Mara even came out and said, we've done everything to screw this kid up. Does Daniel Jones turn around at this point and say, I've played enough where I have a little bit more leverage than maybe I would have had if I was a free agent last season? You declined my option. The new regime, played me, but they also brought in insurance and Tyrod Taylor. Like, I think Daniel Jones is looking at this and saying, this organization has not done great by me. And so, like, while I feel comfortable being here and I love playing with my teammates, let's make no mistake, like, this isn't a one-way street where I'm just pouring all this affection and love to the Giants and I'm just sitting around waiting to find out if they're going to reciprocate. I think those comments made me believe that there's a bigger likelihood that Daniel Jones is not a Giant because maybe he wants to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I think there's so this becomes fascinating, and I agree with you. And there's a couple of things that I just want to briefly mention about this because, again, overall I liked it. One thing I'm going to say right out of the gate, the contrast between the Vikings game and the Eagles game when it comes to Daniel Jones specifically, I think the truth very much lies somewhere in the middle. And we can talk about the wide receivers and everything else. Again, even with quality wide receivers, improving the players around him, I still think the truth is somewhere in the middle and far closer, far closer to the Vikings game than to the Eagles game, right? But I do think we saw, yes, there are still these things that he needs to grow and learn with. One little thing I'm just going to throw out here about Daniel Jones and hitting this market, because there's a couple of very easy things the Giants can do. But it's worth noting, a team who is as powerful as anyone and who we're all rooting for to beat the Eagles next week is the San Francisco 49ers. And when you look and see that a guy like Mr. Irrelevant, Brock Purdy, has played to a 65.5 QBR and has thrown 13 touchdowns and no interceptions, effectively over just 6 games to end the regular season because the other ones were 4 of 9 in garbage time. It is a little note. And by the way, they have a ton of great weapons there in San Francisco, and it's a great system. And they have Christian McCaffrey and Daniel Jones and Barkley. But it is one of those little things where I do perk up and go, it's still a reminder, guys. Like, we all talk about the Giants have a lot of growing to do, and they certainly do. But I do think this all falls into the pot. So what I think could be happening here with Daniel Jones is you mentioned a lot of these factors about, like, not like you guys have exactly given me the best chance to succeed here. And I wonder how he felt about this season as well. To your point, right? You don't get the 5th-year option picked up. So it's understood you have to prove it. Then you have Dable, give him a little bit of guff there early in the season, and he turns it on and he plays well. But maybe he's looking at it and saying, okay, even if we go draft the number 1 wide receiver, we're still another receiver away for this group, right? Offensive line. Feliciano's not the answer. I'm going to need a center. I'm probably going to need another guard. And I'm going to see if Evan Neal develops in his second year. There's a lot of factors. Like, there's a ton of factors around what he may want to do best. The saving grace, if you want to say it, for the Giants is they can just franchise tag him. And they can pay him a big chunk of money, and they can have him for next year. Do you think there's any? So I think the most likely is potentially a franchise tag and then negotiating off of that to extend the timeline here. The other one is the transition tag. After everything that's gone on this season, and we think Daniel Jones has played well, do you believe that Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen look at Daniel Jones and say, we saw the incremental growth and we know where he can go and we want him here long term? Or do you think they look at it and say, this is still a rebuild. What a shocking, successful season we had. And we still want to approach it like, could there be an option out in the market? Could there, I just wonder how much of that is going on behind the scenes for the Giants.
Yeah. So I have been very favorable in my feelings on Daniel Jones.
Yeah.
But after this game and after hearing what Daniel Jones said and trying to sift through like all the information that's going on, I think it's literally a coin flip whether Daniel Jones is back with the Giants from either his side or from the Schoen and Daboll side. And the reason why is, look, the Giants have $55 million in cap space right now, right? Let's just say they franchise tag Daniel Jones at $32 million. He's making $7.5, $8 million. So you're saying $25 million of that goes to retain Daniel Jones, right?
Now, and that could go up a little bit based on other QB contracts this offseason. The number will move, but
right. But you just ballpark it with me so that we can think about it. Now, all of a sudden, maybe you ask Leonard Williams to take a pay cut, but what if he says no? And also, if you outright release him, then we got to fill his spot too. Then you start thinking about, okay, maybe we could save a couple bucks with Kenny Golladay not being on the roster anymore. But then we're also probably giving $13 to $14 million to Saquon Barkley. And all of a sudden, Adam, you're talking about like $15 million here and the draft to be able to address multiple inside linebacking positions, a cornerback for sure, a defensive lineman, most likely, another offensive lineman, a number 1 wide receiver, and probably another tight end, to be honest with you. And maybe the Giants sit there and say, if we pay Daniel Jones, who we think is a top 15 quarterback in the league, $35 million, we don't have enough to be able to fill the holes of the rest of the roster. And so while I love Daniel Jones and I would love to see him back, I do think a world where Giants are picking late in the first round, they look and they say, has one of these quarterbacks like Richardson or Levis or whoever falls to them late, can we get 70 cents on the dollar by having Tyrod Taylor start a few games, get this guy ready, and put that $40 million towards the rest of the roster, which is in dire straits right now?
And this is, you can go back. This is the way I talked about it when they signed Tyrod Taylor last off season, and the idea of just, hey, you've put the system in place in case, and you don't pick up the 5th-year option in case. And now you're here. And it is fascinating. Like, again, I would like Daniel Jones to be back, right? I think that he proved it this year, right? I think you give him Justin Jefferson and he has 20 touchdowns this year at least, not just 15. And then all of a sudden you're talking about 28 total with his rushing touchdowns as well, right? And the numbers look that much better. And the completion percentage there and the legs are there. But if we want to, and a lot of people brought this up because we were talking about, remember, Dave Gettleman, listen, yeah, he made some huge blunders, but he also gave you a lot of nice core pieces. But one of the biggest blunders was the restraints in which you have placed the Giants financially over this season and probably for the next season and maybe even one more beyond that to fully get it cleaned up. That's the hard part here. And at that point, you're just wondering, it's like, how do you massage your way to the place where you have the flexibility to do the things in free agency and in the draft that you want to accomplish? So it does become fascinating, man. I am very curious to see what happens. And, I'll just throw in here because somebody mentioned JCNYC in the chat. Remember, a guy like Azeez Ojulari, who we've really liked when he's been on the field, here's a guy that plays across from Kayvon Thibodeau. And you're going to have to invest to have a significant backup plan there in place going into next season as well. So where you spend your draft capital and the limited amount of money you can spend in free agency is going to be fascinating. Let's cap this off by saying, do you think the Giants bring back Saquon Barkley?
Yes.
Do you think that Leonard Williams is still a Giant?
With his cap hit, I think yes. I think if the cap hit wasn't there, I don't know if he would be. So I'm going to say yes.
Do you think Daniel Jones is a Giant next year?
Yes, I do.
Bonus. Here's a bonus one. Do you think Kenny Golladay is a Giant next year?
No.
Because we all, and the reason why I throw it out there is we all assume he'll be gone. Remember, the dead cap number is still big on his contract. Like, it's still going to cost you money to get off of him. And it's just one of those things where you're like, yeah, again, if you're Joe Schoen, we get it. You occupy one of the 53. You don't have a ton of value, but it's more valuable to us to not spend money to have you not be here than to just pay you to be here. And maybe something happens. Like, it's very fascinating, some of the restraints that are around him. I tend to agree with you on all of the fronts. And I'll be very curious to see what we hear. I think end of February is when some of these contract things can start to come into focus for the Giants around Daniel Jones, around Saquon Barkley. I assume they all get brought back. I think you maybe have the specific date there. I assume they all get brought back. I assume it's the negotiating piece, and this is what happens. But it is interesting, specifically on Daniel Jones, at the end of the day, to think about a player that maybe is doing as much self-evaluation and organizational evaluation as they were doing with him, right? And that's something I don't think any of us thought about. We all just said, Daniel Jones, so lucky to be a part of the New York Football Giants. Maybe he's looking and saying, I wonder where Sean Payton's going to go be a head coach. Maybe that team needs a quarterback, right? Like, there are situations that could be very favorable for him. Interesting to see how he plays it out.
I mean, keep in mind, Adam, Daniel Jones went to Duke. He knows the Carolinas very well. Do the Carolina Panthers need a quarterback? There's going to be other teams that are at least going to ask the question.
The Raiders are going to need a quarterback. The Buccaneers are going to need a quarterback. Yes. The Sooners are out there, man.
And keep in mind, the one thing that I keep coming back to is Joe Schoen knows how valuable draft picks are and assets are, Adam. I see a world where the Giants franchise tag Daniel Jones, and maybe they look to trade him. Maybe there's an opportunity where a team would look to maybe acquire Daniel Jones so that you just don't give away an asset of a potential top 18 quarterback in the league for nothing, right?
Yeah, and let me I'll just throw out the one extra thing. I don't know if I said this before when we were talking about him. Remember the transition tag? The transition tag is 2 first-round picks if they slap Daniel Jones with that. And now the reason that this is a one or the other on this, because if you slap him with that, then I think that Daniel Jones wants to be gone anyway, because it means you're still not fully committed to him, right? And if you slap him with that, I think Daniel Jones and his agent would be doing everything they could to try to shop himself somewhere and say, hey, if you are, the Saints, maybe they're not quite high enough. You mentioned the Carolina Panthers. If you're one of these teams and you miss out on the QB class, hey, yeah, it's an extra first-round pick, but you can think about that as being, we could move up in the draft and go get a quarterback for our first and another one. Or we could send them to the Giants and bring in a guy that, if you believe in him and his skill set, could certainly be as valuable as any of these guys. And remember, we mentioned this other episode, he's only a year older, Daniel Jones, than CJ Stroud is coming out in this year's draft class, which is absolutely fascinating, right?
Yep, couldn't agree more. Absolutely. We had some questions in the chat about when
good on you, because I was trying to pull it up, but people know I can't multitask.
Just wanted to double check March 15th prior to 4 p.m. You got to make sure that you at least put in offers if you have any restricted free agents. You also have to be under the salary cap for 2023. That's important for teams like the Saints that look like they're going to be like $40 or $50 million over the cap right now. They're going to have to make some maneuvers before they can even sign free agents. So look, we do have a little bit more football to be played. Obviously, we've got both championships games coming up. We've got the Super Bowl that's a little bit later this year in February. And then right after that Super Bowl, you've got less than a month almost to be able to decide what it is you want to do and get all your ducks in a row before free agency starts.
One of the longest at the end of the days in OGP history, but you get over to YouTube where people are in the chat. We're going to get into a lot of these kind of discussions, the key dates that matter this offseason, running down the list. One of the things we're going to be really excited to do is just run through the roster and say, hey, how did these guys grade out? What was expectations coming in, and where did they end their seasons? Because a lot of guys significantly improved how we perceived them over the course of this season on the podcast feed as well. Go check it out over there. And we're going to do, it's the off season now for the Giants and for the podcast. So we're going to spread ourselves out a little bit more here. We may do still 3 episodes over the next couple of weeks, and then we'll have slightly longer shows, but we'll do them maybe 2 times a week as key information comes out. So a little bit of adjustment on the podcast side of things. So we get a little reprieve, man. If they had, obviously, if they just, ended the season not making the playoffs and beat the Colts, it would have been huzzah, Instead, they made the playoffs, they won a game, and then they got trounced. So we have to lick our wounds here a little bit. We will be back in, though. We'll talk about those championship round matchups and who's going to the big game. It can't be the Eagles. It can't be the Eagles, guys. Come on. Everyone get it together. We'll continue to break it all down. Great season, though, man. Great season. We said this along the way. Over 300 episodes now for us. Had a lot of fun doing it. Had a lot of fun doing it with Andy. So that's the deal, my friends. And as he would want, need, and nay, quietly, I think, quietly in this moment, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.